Welcome back, everybody. You are listening to the very first installment of the NTC podcast for 2023. We're excited to be back. Hope you enjoyed your Christmas, your New Year's. We're all wonderful. Mines weren't too bad. Copped some Nuggets gear. First Christmas Day game, Nuggets Suns, was a good time. So really enjoyed it. So, welcome back, everybody, to NTC. We're glad to be back with you guys. This is episode 53. And we're going to be discussing a few little minor details here. I mean, I say minor, but they're really a big deal in the grand scheme of NBA rosters. So we're going to dive into that. Colin, back on the pod, man. Hope you enjoyed your holidays as well. Hope they treated you well and ready to jump back on the horse here for the new year.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to be back. I enjoyed my holidays with friends and family. Happy New Year to you. Glad to get going again.
Yeah, let's hit it, man. Let's hit the ground running.
Cool.
The NBA doesn't stop. It didn't stop over the holidays. We're going to discuss an event that actually happened over the course of the December timeline. We're going to tie that into what we're talking about here this afternoon. But I mean, you guys know the drill. We have our official sponsor here over at NTC, Bet99 Sportsbook. This is a prime time for betting. This is a prime time to get in on the action while we're approaching the All-Star break. There's a lot of injuries going on in the NBA right now, unfortunately, but that also means opportunities for other guys to step up. So if you're looking to place a bet on a team, on a player, you're feeling good about a performance coming up here in the next few weeks or months, be sure to put that money down over at Bet99 Sportsbook. Bet99.com is where you guys want to go to manage all that information and get involved with them. So be sure to check them out. They've been a great partner of ours, and we'll hope to keep it going here as we enter a whole new year in 2023. So first things first, man, we're going to be discussing 10-day contracts. That is the first matter of discussion here on the podcast. This is a big tool for NBA teams to build out their roster because, like I mentioned, injuries hit every team. We've seen it with, I think, the Miami Heat are going through it right now in a big way. The Phoenix Suns are in free fall with their plethora of injuries. Several other teams out there are just kind of trying to find their way through the middle of the season as these things pile up. And that's one of the reasons why the NBA implemented this measure of adding to your roster 10-day contracts. There's a G League showcase, which we're going to talk about here in a little bit. There are several other opportunities. You know, the G League has the G League Ignite team. I mean, there's so many different ways that teams can get their eyes on guys that are veterans that have been through the league already, like Derek Favors, who just signed a 10-day here actually in the few minutes where we were preparing to jump on. Guys like PJ Dozier, who had an injury, but they're still really young and looking for an opportunity to get back on an NBA roster. Plenty of other guys that just want opportunities. And these 10-day contracts are unique because they can't be signed until January 5th. So before we hit the new year, you can't sign 10-day contracts whatsoever. And as the name states, they're 10 days in length or 3 games, whichever period of time is longer. But here's the other thing about 10 days. Once you hit the part in the NBA calendar to where a 10-day could take you past the last regular season game, that's when you're prohibited from using them. So let's say, for instance, you're the Denver Nuggets. It seems like a perfect example. And you hit game number 80 and you have not signed a 10-day contract or your 10-day contracts have expired. You are no longer able to sign another one because, as the name states, 10 days or 3 games, the 3 games could take you past the game 82, which would be the end of the season. So at that point, you're no longer able to sign contracts. And it's also worth mentioning that, if you find a player that you really like, you can give them a 10-day. Let's say they ball out. Let's say they average 30 points a game. I don't know. That's probably not going to happen, but just for the case of this example, that'd be crazy, right? If that happened, that's an instant guaranteed contract. You give him a second one. You say, cool, I like this guy. I want to give him another opportunity. That's great. After the second one, your hands are kind of tied a little bit because you either have to let the player go back into free agency or you have to sign them to a contract for the rest of the season. So at that point, you have to make a decision. So there's a lot of different nuances in this 10-day contract. I just covered a few of them. But on your end, Colin, what do you see as far as the benefits of the 10-day contract? And are there any other little nuances of this role, this way to sign players that we should know about?
Yeah, just a couple of things. Like you said, we're we're hitting the time in the season when some key dates pop up. Obviously, we talked about the December 15th when a lot of the players who were signed in the offseason are now available for trades. And now with the January 5th, we have 10-day contract availability. And with that, what we had in mid-December was what's called the G League Showcase, where they have in Vegas, they have all the league executives and decision makers go out there, and media members. Essentially, it's not open to the public. It's aired on ESPN, but it's not open to the fans live. They play several games over the span of a week or 10 days, I believe. And essentially, it's to showcase all the players in the G League in anticipation that on January 5th, these 10-day contracts are going to open up, injuries are going to occur, and roster spots are going to start opening up as well. And we'll talk about in this podcast the waiver of non-guaranteed contracts as well. So roster spots are going to start opening up. But what's interesting here is with the G League, unlike some other sports, a lot of the players on the G League rosters can be signed by other teams, and that's what's interesting. So if a player is on a G League, Dallas Mavericks G League affiliate, as long as he's not signed to a two-way contract or just a standard NBA contract, any other team can pick him up for a 10-day contract or a two-way contract, or eventually convert him into an NBA contract. Mm-hmm. So that's why they have these G League showcases, so that can happen. And there, a few of these guys who have been on the showcase and perform really well end up signing these 10-day contracts, and then end up signing rest of the season contracts. And then, who knows where it goes from there. Of course, you have some success stories for these guys in the G League who traveled around, who got poached here and there, went back and forth. Gary Payton, the second, is the most recent one who just won a ring. Alex Caruso is another one. So it's always really important that these guys are being scouted by all the teams, because you can go out and poach any of these guys who aren't signed to a two-way contract or an NBA contract.
Exactly. Those are great points to make about this contract and who is eligible to be signed. Mm-hmm. It's definitely unique in how you can quote unquote poach guys. There's been a few times where I've gone on Heat Twitter, and there's a guy we're all looking at. We're like, this dude is balling out in the G League. He's having a great campaign so far. Then all of a sudden, here comes the Spurs. They just
right.
stuff them right under their noses. So that's permitted. They're not affiliated with any specific team.
Yep.
Teams do have their G League affiliates, but as you said, if they're not on a two-way, they're not bound to that team. So someone else can come and pick them up. Now, it's also worth mentioning that these two contracts types that we're mentioning, the two-way and the 10-day, cannot be combined. So they're mutually exclusive. If you sign someone into a two-way, they can't be on a 10-day, and vice versa, just because of the nature of the contract. If someone's under a two-way contract, they can go between the NBA and the G League affiliate. I think they can spend up to, I think it's 45 days with the actual NBA team during the season. And a prime candidate for that, guy that I think of, is Orlando Robinson, who's currently on a two-way from Miami. And I'm just thinking, I know they want to sign this dude to a rest of season contract because he's been having great minutes with Bam being injured, Dwayne Dedmon, a shell of himself. His on-off numbers are horrendous. Whenever he comes in the game, the team just hemorrhages points. So there's definitely great uses for a two-way and a 10-day. There's times to use them. But just wanted to point out that they can't be combined in any way. They have to be done. You pick one, you pick the other. But I do love how they offer great opportunities. And the 10-day is a lot of pressure because you only get 10 days or 3 games. But Derek Favors is going to come in for the Hawks, who are having injury issues of their own, going to get a great opportunity. And then PJ Dozier, who I'd forgot about for a while because he's been out with an ACL tear. He just got picked up by the Kings for a 10-day contract. And during his most recent campaign, which was the 2020-21 season, he averaged about 7.7 points on about 41% from the field, 31% from the three-point line. But he's a defensive specialist. And we know that there are a lot of teams like the Kings. And that's why I think they picked him up, is because of his defensive prowess on that end of the floor. So I can't wait to see how these guys perform with that very small window of opportunity, but it is an opportunity nonetheless.
Yeah, and that's what's great about it. And just to go back on the two-way contracts as well, teams are limited to 2 two-way contracts, and they get 2 additional roster spots on the active list for those two-way contracts. Whereas the 10-day contracts, they go on your active list for the 15 max roster spots, and then the 2 additional to make it 17 are only for those two-way contracts.
That's a good point to make.
Mhm.
It's definitely nice to have those two ways that are not bound to that 15 player max on your team, because like we keep going back to injuries and even just rest days for these players. It's just kind of the nature of the game we're in today. 10 days or two ways didn't exist back in the 90s, early
Right.
2000s, things like that. But I feel like there wasn't as much of a need for them back then because you didn't have so much of a shuffle between guys going in and out of the lineup. If you look back to guys like, let's just say, the John Stocktons of the world and the Michael Jordans, the Gary Paytons, I mean, these guys played probably at least 72, 75 games every
Right.
season. So there wasn't as much of a need for you to go pick up guys to come in and take their place when they're sitting out. John Morant is a guy that he doesn't really miss huge chunks of a season. He doesn't have like injuries like an ACL tear, things like that. But he's going to miss a game here, a game there, a game here. So it's nice for teams to be able to bring in guys to kind of take their place, uh, get into some of those empty spots left over by those players that do miss games. So I think in today's NBA specifically, 10 days and two ways are especially effective and very useful just because of the way guys are in and out from one day to the next. You don't know who's going to be playing. You don't know if you're going to be the Heat going on national TV right about now, playing the Thunder, missing four starters.
Yeah, well, I was
Yeah.
gonna say, look at all the injuries they have. I mean, they
Yeah,
need they need those 10-day contracts, and it's
seriously,
great too because it's a great conduit to the G League and to veteran players, like you said, PJ Dozier trying to get back into the league. It helps out both sides, the veteran players and these guys who have been trying to work their way into the league, for a year or two, who've been bouncing around. So it's
for sure.
both the 2 ways and the 10 days are a way to showcase your talent when you get that chance.
Absolutely. And if you are able to hang around long enough, let's say you get those 2 10-day contracts, you impress enough that the team wants to retain you, that is an option as well.
Mhm.
But when it comes to contracts that were signed, let's say back in the summertime, there is a certain date to where a lot of these contracts become fully guaranteed. And we're actually coming up on that date. I think it was actually today, January 10th, is when majority of the contracts that are signed back in the summertime become fully guaranteed for the season. And that kind of brings us to our next topic here, Colin, because teams do have decisions to make. Back on January 7th, that's when teams had to make these, they had to waive players in order for them to be off their books and for that guaranteed money to not hit their books for the season. So we saw a few players get waived earlier in the week, last week, leading up to this day, because you have this date here where the contracts are fully guaranteed. So for certain teams, this matters a lot because let's say you're the Boston Celtics. This is the example we're going to use for this discussion. You have a guy like Noah Vonleh. He's on the very outskirts of the rotation. He's a luxury pickup. You know, you're not relying on him for a lot of minutes. He's not a Horford. He's not a Grant Williams. He's not firmly entrenched in the rotation. So they can look at that contract and they can look at their salary situation. And for them specifically, I mean, they were right up over the luxury tax line. And the Celtics made the decision to waive Vonleh in advance of the guaranteed date. And I believe what I read is it will save them about $7 million in salary and tax. Because we got to remember, once you're over the tax line, you're penalized once you go a certain amount over the tax. So you can't just look at the face value of the contract and say, oh, they saved 1.5 million or something. Because
Mhm.
tax teams, there's an additional penalty that you incur. So for them, it's a lot more than that. So if you're just over the tax, if you're not looking to pay that number, or you just want to reduce your tax bill, it makes a lot of sense for teams like the Celtics to make a move like that. And I'm not sure if I said that they waived him or whatever. They actually traded him to the
Right.
Spurs. I wanted to
Right.
clarify that. So they traded him to the Spurs, and the Spurs sent them back a very heavily protected second round pick,
Max
essentially like
protection that you could get. Yeah.
peanuts. Right. So they're
Yeah.
probably not even going to see the pick. It's just like we have to send something back. It's part of the rules. You can't trade a
Right.
player for nothing. So they said we'll give you a pick, but they're probably not going to see the pick. So
Right.
interesting how the Celtics leveraged that play into saving a little bit of cash.
Yeah, yeah, and what's interesting is, we're talking about the cut down day. So the cut down day is January 10th. but you have to clear waivers by January 10th, and it takes
Right.
48 hours to clear waivers. That's why
Exactly.
January 7th is the real
The
cut down
7th.
day.
Yep.
Eric Pincus will say that all the time. If anyone knows Eric Pincus, Sports Business Classroom. But so what happens here is why it's interesting is the trade, and everyone's asking why does it matter if there's a waiver deadline then for the guaranteed contract? Well, what happens is number one is the Celtics don't want to waive him because if they waive him, they're going to get taxed on the salary that's accrued up to the point that they waived him.
Mm-hmm.
That's already accrued and paid. So they're
Yep.
going to get taxed on that. When they trade him, they assign the entire contract to the Spurs. So the entire salary goes with that. So they're not getting taxed on any of that. And just another note on luxury tax and when you determine the tax bill, it's on the last day of the regular season, and then there's some minor adjustments, but that's when the snapshot is taken. So no
Right.
matter how high or low you're going right now, but between all these trades that are going to be made, it doesn't matter until that last day of the regular season. That's why they're able to do this. But the point why the waiver deadline matters right now is because they're able to trade him to the Spurs right now, and then the Spurs are able to waive him.
Yes.
And then they don't have to pay the remainder of the contract. That's the
Exactly.
important part of the trade deadline.
Yep.
So a couple interesting other facets and why, this is such a small deal. It's saving them $7 million, but it's interesting for us to talk about because there's so many different rules that are kind of thrown into this on the salary cap. And that's, kind of what we talk about all the time. So Vonleh had a 1-year, $2.4 million deal, but it's a vet minimum deal. So while he gets paid 2.4 million, the Celtics were only on the hook for 1.8 under the vet minimum rules. So that's what they're going to be taxed on before they ship them out. So at that point, the tax rate, it increases no matter as you go further and further over the tax threshold. You get the rate increases over time. So the math gets more and more complicated as you keep going on. It's not just one set tax rate. So that 1.8 million gets lessened on their team salary, and they save that roughly $7 million in their luxury tax bill. And just to be clear, it's just a bill that the ownership pays as far as the revenue sharing. It's not giving them any salary cap relief, so they're still operating over the salary cap when they're doing any roster moves, any transactions. They still have to deal in the exceptions. The only thing that it's going to help them with is if they do add on another player later, if they look to build, it's going to help ownership, convince ownership, hey, you save $7 million here. It might help them, swallow that pill of paying even bigger luxury bill if they're bringing on a bigger and better player down the road.
Exactly.
And just a couple other quick notes for this is the reason why the Spurs did it here is because one, the Celtics also sent $1.5 million in cash to the Spurs as an
Extra
incentive,
incentive. Yep.
which is nice for them. Obviously, it's a nice check, and then they're able to cut Vonleh and what was accruing. They're able to put on their minimum salary cap because they haven't even hit their floor for the salary cap yet. You have to hit 90%.
Right.
So they're able to at least add that on and then take that $1.5 million in cash, which doesn't affect anyone's salary cap rules. It's just cash between owners at that point. So that's why they did it. And that's what their incentive was to do it. So it's really tricky and interesting how they're able to, these teams are able to save $7 million, send up $1.5 million, help each other with cap relief in a very small deal like this.
Yeah, most people will look at this deal if you're not trained on the intricacies of the CBA. You'll look at the deal and say, Vonleh went to the Spurs and they waived him. And you say, okay, well, that was easy. And you move on. But if you really kind of dive into it and you bring up all those really good points about why each team did it, it makes more sense. Because even for the Spurs, it makes a lot of sense to do this because they get the extra cash and, they can make that deal and they still don't have to, incur that. Can still waive him, prior to the guarantee date. So it's not like they're on the hook for everything if they make this deal. So, for both teams, it makes a lot of sense. And I'm glad you brought up the salary floor because it's such a rare scenario that a team even flirts with the floor just because most teams are over the cap. Not to mention, most times teams aren't even at the floor because they're so far over, they're in the cap or the tax. but you bring up the situation to where they're at the floor, and like there's incentive to get above the floor because if you don't hit that minimum, that shortfall, that amount to between where you are and where that floor is, I believe that's distributed to the players. They
It
get that
is, yeah.
extra money.
Right.
So I'm sure the ownership is like, we might as well spend it on somebody, right? We might as well do something with the money, or otherwise the players that are already on the roster are given this money. So it creates an incentive for these teams to go out there and at least hit 90%, which I'm sure they will. I mean, there's no reason for them not to hit 90%. I mean, that's still, it's a reasonable amount of money. It's not anything extravagant. They're not over the cap. So it's more than likely they'll end up over that floor for sure. And then when it comes to Vonleh's veteran minimum deal that you spoke of, that also operates on a scale. It's based on years of experience.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a vet and you get a minimum deal and let's say you've played 2 years in the league, that amount is going to differ from somebody like Vonleh, who has several more years. I think he has 7 years already of experience in the league. So his minimum is different from somebody that has less experience. So just something else we wanted to point out, because they're not all created equal. Some people may see vet minimum and they're like, okay, that's a set amount. It's different from the mid-level exception or the biannual or the room exception, to where those are fixed numbers. Every team pays that same amount of money to their players if they want to use that exception. For the vet minimum, though, it's different because it's going to depend on how many years of experience they have. So if someone has 9, 10, it's a lot more expensive, relatively speaking, than somebody that has 1, 2, or 3 years of experience. So
Right.
just something to keep in mind when you're looking at veteran minimum. They're not all created equal.
Right. And if people are looking at the No Trade Clause website and looking at the cap sheets, they're going to see all the same number. It's at 1.8 million and change for all these vet minimum deals. That's what the cap hit is for the team, because it's only up to the second year, which right now is that 1.8 million. But
Right.
that doesn't mean all those players are getting paid 1.8 million. Vonleh is getting paid the 2.4. Someone who's a 10-year vet is getting paid more, and someone who's a 3-year vet is getting paid less.
Mm-hmm.
That's only specifically with regard to the cap hit. What they're actually getting paid, the team is paying the 1.8, and then the league out of a fund is paying the remainder of it.
That's a good thing to bring up as well. So as you can see, I mean, there's so many different intricacies when it comes to these different deals. I mean, we got into a little bit of the trades and everything like that. We got into the different exceptions these teams are operating with. And I mean, there's so many rules when it comes to trades. There's like there's a maximum amount of money you can trade in a deal. I'm not sure if you remember this, Colin, but there's a certain amount of money per year each team can trade out and receive.
Yeah,
four,
I believe
4
it's $6 million in and out, which is accounted separately.
Okay.
So now the Celtics have 4.5 million they're allowed to send out, and they can still receive $6 million back, and it's vice versa for the Spurs.
Gotcha.
And again, that doesn't count in any way towards salary cap effects or luxury tax or anything like that. It's just straight cash for the owners. And I believe it's from back in the day, because the owners with the deep pockets, because it didn't count towards cap or have any real rules, they used to just go, here, take this player and I'll give you $5 million, and I'll give you $5 million, and I'll give you $5 million. So it gave them a huge advantage to work with these small market teams and kind of incentivize them to come to a deal. And then all of a sudden they said, they realized that that's not very fair. So they maxed it out at $6 million on each side.
Yep. Yeah, I mean that's definitely something to keep in mind as well, is that there's a certain amount of money. So you're not going to see any trades where it's like, oh, this team gave him $7 million in cash or something like that. There's a limit to every team, which makes sense, because some teams are going to come across this cash a little bit easier than others. So it just makes sense that you're going to have a reasonable amount of money that goes out and comes in every year, straight cash that's not tied to an exception or anything like that. It's just purely separated from these other deals. But that's all. It's very interesting. And I mean, there's more rules that we can go into when it comes to trades. I mean, there's like I mentioned before, a team has to trade something back, in a trade, whether it's a draft pick, whether it's cash considerations. You'll see that term a lot. That's what that means, is that 1 million in cash or whatever to kind of make the deal worth it for another team. You'll see a player contract. You'll see the rights to a player go out in certain deals.
Picks, of course. Yeah.
Yep. So there's a lot of different things that can be sent on these deals. So just so that you keep an eye on when you see these trades go on, these aren't blindly done. I mean, teams do a lot of research. They look into what's required to send back in a trade. They look at their limits of what they can send back, what they can take back, because the money that the money that's involved in the deal, that kind of in where you are in the tax territory and in the salary cap territory, that also determines how much you can take back in a trade.
Yeah.
So if you're way over the tax, I mean, you can take back a lot less money than you could if you were under the cap or just over the cap team. So they do that. Obviously, if you're over the tax, there's certain penalties. That's one of the penalties you have to deal with. So if the Celtics wanted to take back a player in a trade, let's say they were actually getting someone back, and not just a second round pick that probably won't convey, they would be limited,
right?
Based on how much money they've already spent, as opposed to the Spurs. They can take back a lot more money because, like you said, they're only at barely 90% of the cap itself, not even into the tax. So the limitations of teams really differ depending on how much money you've already spent on your roster, your team salary number. That kind of determines what you have at your disposal.
Yeah, and actually going back too, as far as working and operating over the cap, we were talking about the veteran minimums. That is an exception to the rule. You're able to sign these vet minimums even though you're over the cap, and that applies to those 10-day contracts. So that's why any team that you're talking about they're able to sign these 10-day contracts because they're all minimum contracts. So you're able to sign these players to 10 days.
Yes. And while we're on 10-day contracts, there's another little facet that I forgot to mention. It's the fact that the salary is prorated based on the number of days that are covered by the contract. So, it's an amount of money that's adjusted based on, if it covers the 10 days, that's one thing. If it covers more than 10 days, let's say there's 3 games that you play for a team, but it goes 11 days or 12 days. So that 10-day contract amount also can differ a little bit because it's prorated, and it's going to kind of depend on how many days are covered by the term of your contract. So just something to keep it on as well. You can see a trend here. When we cover a number or a rule or anything, it splinters into so many different directions. Right. So there's like one scenario, there's another scenario, there's another one. So it's just like, it's like a never-ending spider web. You can go so many different directions, which makes it fascinating, but also you got to keep your mind right so you can keep track of everything.
Yeah, it really reminds me of, I'm a lawyer, of course, and anytime someone asks me something about a specific law or whatever, hey, if this happens, what happens? And the answer is always it depends. And it's almost the same with the CBA because there's so many different rules and exceptions, and every team is in a different scenario, and every transaction is going to be different, that it's all going to apply entirely different. Like the Vonleh trade, they save $7 million on trading him. If another team trades a vet minimum contract, they might not necessarily save $7 million. It might be something it's going to be an entirely different math equation.
Good point for sure. Yep. And this is something that it's pretty interesting. I'm not sure if you're aware of this. I didn't even remember this until I went back to the salary cap FAQ that Larry Kuhn manages, that I think everybody that if you're even remotely interested in any of this stuff, highly encourage you to look at that, because I can promise you, unless you're just crazy like that, you don't want to go to the actual CBA and try to read all that, because it's that legal jargon that I'm sure, Colin, what's going on there.
I'm crazy enough to do that, but I still look at the FAQ. It doesn't matter. Yeah. Everyone does. Everyone does. Everyone in the league does.
Oh yeah. Because it's like a book. If there's a book that's let's say it's 600 pages, you look at the book and you're like, I mean, I guess I'm interested in the topic of the book, but I don't want to read 600 pages, 650 pages. And then somebody comes out here and it's like, well, let me help you with that. Here's an abridged version. You're like, that's what I need right there. I'll take that.
Yeah.
That's the purpose that it serves.
Right. Absolutely. It's the Spark Notes.
Exactly. We need Spark. We need the Spark Notes, man. That's essential. But what I saw in there regarding 10 days is the number of 10 days that you can have on your roster is dependent on the number of players that you have at that time. So if you have 12 players total signed at one time, you can't sign any 10 days. It's 0.
Mm-hmm.
When you go to 13, it's 1, 14 is 2, 15 is 3.
Mm-hmm.
So the number you can sign is also dependent on how many players you have on your roster. So that's also in flux,
Right.
depending on how many guys you have at one time. So
Which is going
I
to
want to
be
highlight that.
interesting with a team like Miami, right? Because it depends who's going to be on the active roster and inactive roster, and who,
Yeah.
what is happening with those injuries and what they're actually doing with those players at the time, and
Yep.
whether they actually are on the active roster. Because if they're taking them off of the active roster and they're down to 12, then they can only sign 1 10-day. So
Mm-hmm.
that's an issue, right? So that
Exactly.
it's really all those different intricacies, they get really complicated.
They do. And the situation of the team, I mean, it varies so much throughout the season. In Miami's case, you'll see players go in and out of the G League. When you have that two-way contracts, not the 10-day, but the two-way,
Mhm.
you'll see them bounce because
Yeah.
it's dependent on the needs of the NBA team at any given time. So right now, I think Jamal Cain is their second two-way player that they have currently, aside from Orlando Robinson. I think he was recalled from the Skyforce because of all the injuries they have. Kyle Lowry is out tonight. Caleb Martin, Bam, Tyler Hero. So they recalled him. So you'll see guys go back and forth, just depending on if the team is healthy, if they're banged up. But the teams do have to be cognizant of the fact that you don't have an unlimited use for these players. It's a small sample of the 45 days. So you have to use it wisely. If you're fully healthy or I don't know, you don't really care about that game during one of those games that you play, like the result isn't as important, like you're playing a bottom feeder like the Spurs or something like that, maybe it's not the best time to use it. Maybe a better time would be to where, hey, we have our whole starting four of our 5 starting guys are out. We need another contract to add into the mix. That might be a better time to use it. So that goes back and forth depending on the needs of the team. So you'll see guys go back and forth all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Keep an eye on.
Right.
But if we're talking about 10 days, man, like how do you feel about those 2 pickups, like PJ Dozier, Derek Favors? I'm sure more will be coming. Like, do you feel like they'll have any kind of significant impact for those franchises?
I mean, to be honest, probably not. But it's great to see. The only thing that you really want to see is if there's any contribution at all, and if they can make it onto the team and eventually into the rotation. What you're really
Mhm.
trying to do is build depth, right? If you can get a 10-day contract player who ends up signing a rest of the season deal and eventually makes it into the rotation, he's probably not going to end up playing in the playoffs or anything like that into that kind of rotation. But if he's helping your depth on a team that's trying to make their way to a playoff run, and you need to rest guys, knowing that you're in the playoffs, that's going to be a huge help for teams. And so, do I think that those guys are going to be significant contributors? Dozier maybe on the defensive end of things, but I don't think that they're going to be anything that we'll be talking about as far as once the playoffs are here. But certainly, these guys doing the little things and giving quality minutes can go a long way. And it might not be on the stat sheet, but it might be helping other guys lessen their minutes and get ready for a long season and then get ready for the playoffs.
That's the key right there. It's giving those guys that are in the rotation an opportunity to have their minutes reduced, to take a couple of games off. I think that's the biggest benefit of having these guys here. I don't want to disrespect them and say they're a placeholder. I don't want to say anything like that because they are a really solid player still, even if they're not on the team.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't on a team before today, but they do play a big role when it comes to preserving the vets, preserving the guys that will play a lot of minutes in the playoffs. And I mean, I'm going back to Derek Favors' numbers from last year with the Thunder. It was just last year in the league prior to this. You look at it and you see 5.3 points or 4.7 rebounds, which isn't a lot, but I mean, he played 16 minutes a game. If you have a guy that can
Yeah.
reliably come in and play 16 minutes a game, I mean, that's significant if you're trying to spell your starting big man because I mean that's your backup center. I mean, they're probably not going to eclipse 20. So I mean that's a legitimate backup big
Right.
spot, backup player at some position in the league. And he's going to be a solid on the boards. I mean, he's almost at 5 rebounds a game in under 20 minutes a game. So that's definitely translatable. He's always been good at that. And he can score in a pinch. He's not going to be a primary scorer for you out of the post, but he can get some offensive rebounds. Some second chance opportunities will definitely be there for the Hawks. And I think the main reason they did this move is to shore up that front line with Clint Capella missing so many games.
Yeah. Yeah. And God forbid, there's plenty of guys who are already on these active rosters with full NBA contracts who can't contribute as well as you'd like to see these guys. I mean, there's plenty of them out there. So if he's contributing anything like that, it doesn't have to be anything significant, just good quality minutes, playing good defense and low turnover percentage for all these guys. I think that's all the coach can ask for from these guys. And if they give more than that, great. But that's really what you're looking for.
Absolutely. Yeah. And he's going to stay in his lane. Like Derek Favors, you don't have to worry about him going outside of who he is. He's going to get boards. He's going to be solid for you. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I mean, we just talked, this is a player that's a lot older. So, I mean, Derek Favors is, he's already 31. But for PJ Dozier on the other end of the spectrum, early 20s, he's going to come in, and we mentioned his defense. I think that's a big reason why they signed him. But also, he's just a spark plug. He has a lot of energy.
Yeah.
Before he went down with the injury, I mean, he was a high flyer. He has a lot of athleticism at 6'4", 6'5", at that guard position. And it fits right into what Sacramento loves to do. They have a lot of energy, a lot of pace. They move the ball a lot. So I think as PJ Dozier coming into there and being a good transition guy and another player that can just keep the ball moving, not necessarily be a go-to like shot creator. I mean, he's not efficient enough for that.
Mm-hmm.
But as someone that's just going to run around out there and get up and down the court really quickly, generate some easy points for the Kings, it'll just keep their elite offense up to par, even when maybe Fox misses a game or two, or someone like Kevin Huerter does. He can kind of keep the flow going in the absence of maybe one of those other guys.
Yeah, and even if they're not missing the game, what you just said, that word spark plug is exactly what you want from those guys. Just come in and bring some energy when you're on the floor on that, in that type of position. I think that's what you're also looking for from a player like PJ Dozier.
100%. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there's so many ways you can go with this, Colin, but, unfortunately, that's going to be where we cut off today. But, I mean, you know where we are, guys, with this. We try to cover all the intricacies as much as we can. And there are more significant dates coming up here in the NBA calendar. So if you're looking for any of that information, be sure to check out NoTradeClause.com. We have a full NBA calendar page where we track cut down dates. The fully guaranteed date is on there. The 10-day contracts, like everything like that. Big games coming up.
Trade deadline's coming up now.
Trade deadline, yep. That's going to be a whole other beast. So prepare yourselves, guys. But all that stuff is on our website. So definitely be sure to check that out. And we'll have more episodes like this where we cover specific details here as these deals come about. There's trades, there's signings, all that stuff. We got you guys covered. Colin, thanks so much again, man, for joining me. Always a good time.
Absolutely.
Always really insightful. Learning about the different ins and outs of the CBA. Your loyal jargon, your lawyer jargon and talk and knowledge comes in handy. So we're glad to have you.
Appreciate it. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir. And guys, be sure to keep it locked here. We have more episodes coming soon. Special guests are online for this year, 2023. Big things coming. So we appreciate your support. And hopefully you guys will join us here on the ride as we go through the rest of the season. Hopefully get back to Summer League this year and have a whole bunch of other opportunities here lined up. So thanks so much to you guys for joining us for this episode. We'll be back real soon. Until then, enjoy these games. Have a great rest of your day. And we'll see you here on the next installment. Take care.